But I worry a little bit about their emphasis on natalism, because I know part of women's liberation is to get women to the factories, because 14% of the Soviets were killed during World War II. They did need more workforce, and so did they in Eastern Europe. But I wondered what the pressure on natalism of having children exacted on sex in these countries.
Yeah. So that's a great question, because different countries had very different natalist policies at different times. And I would say that generally speaking, socialist governments and socialist theorists tend to be fairly pro-natalist. They tend to be fairly pro-family, partially because they actually do care when they ask what women think. And I can show you surveys done in women's magazines in Bulgaria from 1969 that show pretty clearly that women want children. And so the government took it upon themselves to provide for women so that they could combine their reproductive roles with their productive roles in the labor force. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, with the exception of Stalin's Soviet Union between 1936 and 1955, so a specific band of time, Albania and Romania after 1966, almost all East European countries guaranteed access to abortion. The East Germans in particular were very early in liberalizing abortion. And they also had widespread contraceptive use in terms of oral contraceptives. Other countries had shortages around these issues. And for instance, in the Soviet Union after 1955, the primary form of birth control for a lot of Soviet women was, in fact, abortion. And so despite the fact that they were very pro-natalist in their rhetorics, and I'm not for a second going to question that they were, because they were, most of these socialist countries believed that people were happier when they had families with children. That was just their sense of the world. But they did protect women's reproductive rights as much as they could. Now, there were moments when there were restrictions, but none of those restrictions were as strict as they were in the West. And in fact, if you go back to 1990-91 and you look at the reunification negotiations between East and West Germany, the entire reunification process almost collapsed over the issue of abortion, because the East Germans had a much, much more liberal law than the West Germans. And still, to this day, actually, the West German, the now reunified German abortion law is stricter than it was before. So there's this interesting tension. They were very pro-natalist, and yet at the same time, they respected women's rights to control their fertility. And nowhere is this more apparent than what's happening right now in Poland. So in Poland, despite the fact that it was a Catholic country, despite the fact that Pope John Paul II was from Poland, right? Under the socialist government in Poland, women had access to abortion. And now, after the collapse of communism, what we see is incredible restrictions on women's reproductive rights, so much so that there are tens of thousands of women in the streets, in the streets right now, protesting these increasingly strict abortion provisions, right? So that now, under the new law, you can no longer terminate a pregnancy if your child has a genetic defect that is detected in your utero. This is a very, very controversial decision, and as I said, there are huge protests. But I think the other thing that I want to say to you is, and that I think is really important, and then I'll let you ask another question, is that the thing that we can see is after 1989 or 91, if we're talking about the former Soviet Union, birth rates plummet in Eastern Europe. In fact, I think of the top, 20 countries with the fastest shrinking populations in the world right now, 15 or 16 of them are in Eastern Europe, former socialist countries, where women have basically said, nope, no babies. The world is too difficult to have under capitalism, right? We can no longer be mothers. Whereas prior to 89 or 91, as fertility was declining, but nowhere near the incredible crash that we had, fertility crashes, what they call the demographic death spiral in Eastern Europe after 1989. I believe a colleague told me that in Eastern Germany, the birth rate in 91, 92 was the lowest it has ever been in the history of any society, not in wartime. And that shows you that fertility is very much related to the economic system. And one of the things that socialist governments tried to do was allow women the ability to combine motherhood and careers in a way that we've never really committed to in the West, outside of, as you said, some of these Northern Scandinavian countries.